This is Matt Connors, and I'm just going through a couple steps that I'm taking in using text-to-image models for AI. Using Photoshop is using the Photoshop beta, and also Stable Diffusion. So Stable Diffusion, it can be accessed through many different websites that have that model for AI. What I used here was, let me just back up a step. So I was on Night Cafe. I like Night Cafe because it allows you to use different models. In this case, I was using SDXL, which is the most current version in the beginning of September 2023 of Stable Diffusion. And so the way it works on Night Cafe is that you have a certain number of credits. So you get a certain number of credits per day, and then you can spend those to make different images, right? And like a lot of the AI text-to-image models, you need to put in a prompt. So in this case, I made a prompt, and then I captured it. After I use the prompt, I tend to hang on to the prompts because I'll be editing them often later. But I took this and was Stable Diffusion, and I saved it within Photoshop as a note. So I was using the notes feature in Photoshop over here. Concept sketch, pen and marker, limited color palette of a huge hulking steampunk mecha robot with a woman mech driver. The idea is you want to have an activity that's happening. You don't need to say like create a sketch of, just say robot searching through debris. And that would give you a better overall image than saying, very detailed, like try to make a robot. You don't need to include words like try or create for most of the engines. And that includes when you're inside Photoshop using Generative Fill. So what the modeler created for me was this image that you see, which is this mech or robot, and you've got this kind of distorted background. And I chose to do an up-res within Night Cafe. It's about 3,000 pixels wide, I believe, and then I pulled that into Photoshop. So it allows you to download it either with a layer, which is basically putting your like an image stamp on top and indicating who you are. I don't like to do that because I know I'm probably going to make edits afterwards within Photoshop or Sketchbook Pro. So this is when I brought it into Photoshop, and I'm using the Photoshop beta, which was just re-released a couple days ago in the beginning of September 2023. And you can actually have Generative Fill. You see right down in here, there's a possibility to create new content. Like let's just try something in Generative Fill, and I'll say clouds. Keep it really simple. Clouds. So it gives you a prompt. It gives you tips, which is really nice within Generative Fill, encouraging you to make a more detailed prompt. It's all about expectations. Is it managing your expectations? Is it giving you something you want? What I really like is that oftentimes it'll take the overall image itself. So of course, Generative Fill is based on a lot of tools that have existed in Photoshop for a long time. And it's taking a look at the entire image, the contrast, the lines. Well, it's not really measuring lines, but it is getting a sense of like the difference between pixels across your image. So in that way, it's able to reference that and then pull from a big database that Photoshop has, especially because they've been managing a stock catalog for many years. So it creates these clouds. That's not bad. I don't really want clouds in my image, so I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. You do need to realize that if you use another image editing program, whether it's Affinity Designer or Sketchbook Pro or something like that, odds are they're not going to be able to interpret the information in this layer. So it has these little stars on the layer. That indicates that it's a Generative Fill layer. What's interesting about this is you can go ahead, it gives you a couple options. Wow, that's not a cloud, but it's clearly referencing the rest of the image. That one's not bad. I might even keep this one. Although I like the original clouds generated by Stable Diffusion a little bit better because they're wispy and set it in the background, and they don't fight so much in terms of putting this. But you could, if you decided that you like the idea of the clouds but wanted another pass on it, you can just click Generate again. And it's going to use that same criteria, just clouds, and try and generate something within the image in that particular area. So I did create a selection. I would say that if you know where you want to create new content, definitely create a selection. That's a little bit better, and then you can cycle through. I'm cycling through each of these. All of them I find to be a little bit distracting, so I'm going to turn them off, or actually I'm just going to delete that layer so I don't forget about it later. But anyway, what you can also do is use that generative fill to extend the area of your image. Now, this image was originally a little bit smaller, and I expanded canvas. If you're not familiar how to do that, you just go up into, I always forget where that's put, but I believe it's, yeah, here we go, canvas size. And I increased the canvas size. It was already a little bit over 5,000 pixels. I made it 6,000 pixels, and you can either center it, or in this case, I anchored it towards the bottom because I liked the way the image was, so I did it more or less like this, but that was, I had already done that. And the background is only green because I chose that as my background color to be able to show a little bit clearer what I was going to do here. And then I just duplicated the layer. This is a habit that I've gotten into a long time ago. I would duplicate a layer to make sure that if I merge the layers down, I'm not going to lose any of the content. So what you can do is you can actually take an area like this and go ahead and just, if you want it to fill that area, and I'm trying to extend the canvas. The reason why is because I see the edge, I don't see the edge of the robot, and I would kind of like to, and then it's not complete in the very top. So if you just hit generative fill and don't add any additional information, it's going to try and fill to the edge of the frame. And I find this is very useful. Like if you need to remove something, often if you just keep the box empty or indicate remove, it'll try and fill with what it kind of recognizes as background pixels. So if you have sky or something that's very clearly part of the background that Photoshop would recognize as part of the background, it'll just go ahead and knock that out. Now I realize I had that on the wrong layer, so it's probably just gonna, well, it did a good job here of filling on that right hand side. Now, because it's not really recognizing shapes in terms of volume in 3D space, it's just recognizing that there were pixels there. That's why when it added to the edge of the arm and then finished it to end to the background, it's not really hanging on to this shape that was defined through the original stable diffusion image, which I'm not crazy about. And also, if I zoom in close, I've noticed something a little bit strange that happens is that you notice the sharpness of the image overall, the edge detail right here, the line quality, and then the edge fall off. It's not the same. It gets very fuzzy. What I tend to do with this is I go ahead and use, let me find it, unsharp mask. And unsharp mask is just a way to make the edges a little bit crisper. Obviously adjust it as you feel works for your image, but I tend to find it somewhere around 65, anywhere from like 45 to 65, something like that, and keeping the radius around a pixel or a little bit above that. I might need to go a little bit higher because this is a very high res image. And I'm going to go ahead and hit OK, and we should be able to see the difference. So that gets a good part of that sharpness back. In fact, I would push this one even a little further. The more pixels you have in the image, the higher that pixel distance needs to be, because it's effectively creating a radius, a pixel radius from a certain point. Let me just back up a step so we can see the entire image again. Here we go. And I'm going to go ahead and turn that layer off. So I did make a separate layer for edits. I'm going to throw out that layer because I don't want to forget about it. I thought I threw it out. All right. So I extended the edges in a way that I thought was pretty successful. It did remove part of this other building and step it down. I actually like that because I feel like it fades down to the left-hand side. So what I'm trying to encourage is you might need to play with each of the extensions that you make through Generative Fill. Definitely use the options because it gives you 3 options to start with, but you can generate more. If you like the area that you generated, but not necessarily the content, just go ahead and hit generate again, and it'll stack the number of possible solutions. So it starts with 3, and then you can add, I've added as many as like 18. Of course, you're making your file bigger because you're putting all this content into the layer that is fairly fluid, right? So it will make your file quite a bit bigger. So I'm jumping ahead a little bit. So I like the extension here, and I decided to try adding a prompt that that would have a woman coming out of the hatch. So it's not really complete in this image here, but the idea was that it's a mech suit and that there's a woman, probably small scale, coming out of the hatch in the top. But it's not really giving me what exactly I like. So I tried many different variations on this. Let me just cycle through them. So it gave me this first, and then that's not bad, but the scale is off. I really like what happened in the top of the helmet, or kind of you're seeing almost like a sheared off helmet. That one's not bad. I think it's interesting how it's got these cable elements going up into her skin. That one might be the most usable. And then there's just strange things that happen sometimes in terms of the positioning or the content. These are a little closer to one another. It does, the scale is the biggest factor that I find a little bit confusing. This one's completely different. I actually like these kind of variations that don't meet my expectations, but also are so far afield of what I would have imagined. I kind of like it. Like this one, it's very wistful and kind of playful, that maybe she's, small enough that she's looking off in the distance. It's kind of romantic. So and then this variation, there are, whatever the parameters are for the algorithm that they've set up, it is definitely taking into account different ethnicities and different cultures, which I find kind of fascinating. I would love to unpack more about that. Like if we cycle through these, I notice that many of the solutions are either African, Asian, then from, it looks like East Asian, Middle Eastern, lots of different possibilities here, which I think is kind of fascinating. I think there's only like one Caucasian woman in the entire group. And I did specify woman rather than man. We'll have to see how it handles gender in the future. And then there's one that's just a silhouette, which is kind of interesting too. Anyway, these are some of the options and how generative fill works. I find this kind of fascinating, and I've been using it quite a bit to edit images once I create them from a text to image model. And then I'll go through this a little bit further, how I then modify it in Sketchbook Pro, but that'll be the next step. I think I like where this is here. I did have one kind of crazy prompt that I put a mech driver, and I think it did a really interesting job of putting this mech driver. Originally she was on the left-hand side. I had her stretching from left to right, looking in the other direction. The proportion was a little weird, and I think it takes away from what I intended with the image. But I'm going to go ahead and stick with this and then move it into Sketchbook Pro. All right, thanks. But that's a little bit of how to use generative fill within Photoshop.